Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Indie Game Movement, the podcast that talks about the marketing and business of indie games. I'm Andrew Pappas. I'm going to be your host today, and we're going to be reflecting on the past year. We're going to be doing things a little different today, though, because we're going to be revisiting past conversations. In particular, some of the most listened to. But what we're doing is different than just that. It's not just about the most popular or most downloaded episodes. More importantly, what we did with this was we focused on the discussions that I saw surface themes that kept coming up throughout the year. I'm not going to sugarcoat anything. 2025 was tough for a lot of us, leaving many of us in a state of uncertainty that honestly just sucked. But if you know anything about me, I always look at the glass as half full, which means finding lots of different opportunities to make some lemonade out of the lemons that life throws at us. So instead of this just being a highlight reel, think of it as a journey that many of us have been on or are even on right now. And through these discussions, we're going to pull out perspectives and insight that will help guide us with clarity, focus, and confidence into the next year and many to come. So that's what we're going to be talking about right here today on Indie Game Movement. Hey everyone, and we're back. And you know what? Before we jump into this episode, I just wanted to, frame what exactly it is and what it isn't. Some of these conversations that we're going to be listening to it today were, yes, among some of the most listened to this year, particularly the episodes. And what that told me was, that they were resonating, right? There's reasons why they were the most downloaded. There was reasons why people are listening to that content and stuff. But when I looked back at them, what mattered more than just, the numbers and why was getting into why they resonated with people, especially given the year that this industry has had. 2025 was a hard year for a lot of people because, look, layoffs, they started in 2024 and really didn't stop. They carried through right to the end, right up, yes, to the very end. And I'm as I'm saying it, I'm recalling of a few. And honestly, that kind of uncertainty has a way of really shaking your confidence, even when you're doing everything right. So instead of this traditional highlight reel and stuff that I know we have done in the past, and we've done different things around the holidays and stuff. We make it fun. Well, I this time around, I wanted this episode to feel like a guided reflection on the year in terms of what we learned, what kept coming up, and what might actually help us move forward into the next year with a bit more clarity and confidence. Because ultimately, that's what we need, and that's really what we should focus on. And I'm not trying to downplay everything else that has been going on, but if you think about it, whether a year is good or a year is bad, you're still going to need clarity and confidence. And to a degree, those are the things you're going to have a lot more control over anyways. Because life happens. Years could be great, years can suck. But as long as you're in control and understanding of that clarity and having that confidence, you're going to be in a far better position than anyone else who doesn't see it that way. At least that's my perspective. So as we get into this episode, right, as we get into these conversations, these clips, what I see them as is representing a different part of a journey that, like I said before, all of us are probably have been on or are on right now. And it's real stuff, right? Like the elements of just like, facing reality. Like kind of coming to terms with ourselves in a way, which honestly can be freaking scary, but it's true. Another is like how we define success, how we define things in general, and even how we find focus, and even how we create meaningful experiences for us and for other players. And then ultimately, this all comes back to remembering the power that we have. We will always have as small teams, as indie developers. And I know that might sound cheesy and everything else, but it really is the case. You are so much more nimble, flexible. There's so much more of an advantage that you have over any other big studio. AAA even. And yes, it's not just all about the money. Yes, money helps, but really think about it. Think about what you're able to do, how fast you can do it, how, like, there's so many advantages there. And that's really what I want the big takeaway from this too, is just remembering that you still have a lot of this power. You do. And it's in the small teams. It's in the fact that you're an indie developer. And trust me, I know that there's so many other bigger studios that are trying so hard to replicate this because they see that opportunity there, but it just doesn't work because it's not the same. The dynamics are different. So remember that as we get through this episode. So to kind of kick things off, I want to start with this clip from episode 399 with Colin Mack. And, I wanted to start here because this clip in particular names something that I personally feel that a lot of people, experience, but we don't always say out loud. Probably because in our own heads, we're thinking, oh, we're just whining, we're complaining, no one wants to hear this. But it's important that we at least recognize it. And it's hard sometimes. I recognize this in myself too, and the work I've done and leading all the way up to here as well. So, in a year in particular where progress, just felt slower, heavier, probably, harder for anyone to see because of all the things that were going around. That's why I thought that this conversation with Colin really cut through the noise. Because what it's really about is that level of invisible work of everything that you guys are doing that just, feels like it's amounting to not much of anything. Like busy work or things that are important or foundational stuff, however you want to define it. He really gets to the point here. Because I think often we look at this as a means of we're making this mistake that we're failing, we're not succeeding, we're not progressing and everything else. And well, honestly, it couldn't be further from the truth. So I'm going to go ahead and play this clip now, and you can hear what Colin has to say about that.
And that leads me into another question I have is, and I'm trying to look at this from a more broader perspective too, which is like, what do you think most developers misunderstand about pitching a new studio or project? And just for context and clarity, folks, and even for Colin too, not just like, oh, pitching to a publisher, but let's say like in your case, it's like, hey, there's a group of people and you kind of all got together and in a way you're kind of pitching this idea, right? Or whoever you're pitching it to. So, but again, what do you think most developers just misunderstand about that process?
I think that just it's mostly that it takes a staggering amount of work. Just getting every single thing in order. There's it's pretty well known that if you're making like a demo for a convention or something, mm-hmm. work basically stops on the game while you work on the demo instead.
Yep.
And then after the demo, everything that you faked, everything that you set up to look nice for the demo, basically gets thrown out and completely redone because none of it is sustainable or built correctly. It was built under duress, under a very short time frame from developers who maybe crunched, maybe didn't, but they were working solid 40-hour weeks consistently at that point. And when it came, I had this folly that in February or something that I was going to be like, I'm going to pitch my game at GDC. It's like, I've got a month. I can get a pitch together. I spent a month just collating all the feedback from all of the devs I asked for feedback on, like, the pitch itself for, to the point where the pitch is so good that the prototype fell behind because I spent so much time making sure that the pitch was together that I didn't have time to finish my own tasks on the game. And so, we're working on that prototype now in prep for getting it out the door and to publishers. But between that and setting up the company itself, like the legal entity, and holding down a job and building up Creepy Redneck Dinosaur Mansion 3, I just don't have time. And I fully did not anticipate how much time it would take to just get everything in order for starting up a new company. It was opening a bank account. It was setting up the legal entity. It was waiting for those things to, be cleared at the legal level. It was getting the pitch together. It was writing the actual game. It was coordinating all of the people and making sure that they aren't blocking each other when they need to set things up. Because, we can't do level design until our assets are made. We can't light the level until the level is laid out properly. All of these pieces have to fall into place. And it's difficult when you're the person who has to coordinate it and figure out the funding and figure out the pitch. And, everyone helped. Everyone helped. Everyone pulled their weight. I don't mean this to sound like, oh, woe is me, I'm working and none of my developers are pulling their weight. Nothing could be further from the truth. They are all extremely hardworking and skilled and wonderful people. And that alone should speak to how much work it takes, that the pitch we started concepting 2 months ago is like, no, we're still working on that.
Yeah.
What I love about what Cullen shared here is kind of like, in that moment, we can kind of understand how validating it is. Because, like I said earlier, lots of times we will be doing these things. We'll be doing a whole lot of everything but the thing that feels like we're actually progressing, right? And because of that, so many people will feel behind because they're not seeing any external signals. They're not seeing any wins. They're not seeing results, whatever it might be. They're not seeing that progression that they're looking to see. But what Cullen was sharing here, what it does is just reminds us that a lot of the actual progress happens quietly. It happens behind the scenes. And especially in a year like we just had, where everything feels harder to get momentum or any traction or anything like that. This is a reminder that, slow progress doesn't just mean stalled progress. It doesn't mean nothing's happening. It just means that you're laying foundations that are going to springboard you in the future. And really, doing that work and everything else is just going to support you that much stronger. It's going to help you out that much more. But it's a problem we all face. And really what it's about is looking at it differently and understanding, yes, it feels like I'm not moving forward, but you are. I'm trying to think of a better analogy here. I know there's someone's got to have one, but for today, I'm lacking that. But really, stop telling yourself that when you're doing these things that do matter, whether it's administrative or developing processes or whatever it may be, these things matter because it allows you then, in the moments that truly matter, to scale, to move forward, to jump ahead miles beyond what you were going to be able to do before if you didn't do that. So when we accept this reality of even when it feels like stalled progress and everything, it really is just slow progress. It's a form of progress. I would say one of the next questions start to become, if this work is hard and long term, well, what does success look like in that? And I think it's an important point to call out to, because we're doing these things, we're doing it for a reason. We're doing it for results. And what is the results? What are the outcomes we're looking for? And a lot of times it's success. But how do we define success? What does that even mean to us? Is it making bank? I hope not. And I'm not saying you shouldn't be compensated or anything for your time and for the thing you love doing. That's not what I'm implying. It's really about the intention of it. But again, defining that, understanding it, what it really means, and then when I say understand, it's not just as simple as saying, sure, X amount of dollars that I got, X amount of sales, I can fund my next project. But what else does it mean? How do you really visualize and break that process down? What does it mean? How is it fulfilling? All those other things. And one snapshot of how we can look or redefine success was in a clip with Jason Del Roca in episode 410. And why this one stood out to me is because in it, we're kind of challenged by looking at one of the most common assumptions we make in this industry. Because what Jason does in this discussion is he reframes the idea that we're in a business of making games. And instead positions us in the business of building fans. And I love his take on this too, because I generally feel the same way. See, but I look at it a little bit differently. He calls out, but it still relates. He calls out to the business of making games, or how most of us think that. I also think a lot of us think in terms of we're in the business of making a game based off of our passion and stuff. And that's still important too. But the way I see this, it's not so much about how we're making games for ourselves. It's also how we're doing it and how we're making games to serve others. And in a way, that fuels our passion too, and it makes these experiences more fulfilling for us, as well as the people who are playing them. And that's why I love how he repositions this as a business of building fans. I look at it actually in a much deeper level, and how we're serving people and stuff. And I find this really interesting. And here's his take on that exact moment and why it's really important to reconsider that.
You know, Jason, I mean, you've worked with a huge range of studios, but like, you know, in light of all that, everything different and what people are doing, what's the one pattern you keep seeing that gets in the way of their long-term success?
Oh my goodness! I mean, like we can talk hours just on this one question. I mean, there's so many kind of patterns. I mean, obviously, a lot of it comes down to the business side of things, where so many game developers, game studios, you know, are really coming at it from a passion, creation, you know, artistic point of view as designers, artists, programmers, etc. They're really not, you know, thinking deeply about the business side of things, and you know, understanding what, you know, it means to be building a studio, building a business is sort of a separate thing from building a game. And there's a couple of patterns. I mean, there's many patterns, but there's sort of two things I want to lay down. One is solving for success, which means that you need to understand what kind of success you're trying to achieve. So, for example, if you're you know, putting a studio together and you're going to embark on this journey, you know, being an indie and try to succeed and be a professional and, you know, earn a living by making games, not just as a hobby and, a fun pastime. And we're starting a new studio. It's okay, Andrew, we got to make a living, pay rent, put food on the table for our families. Okay, so we have to make revenue. All right, well, let's go make a puzzle platformer. That seems like a fun game. We played a bunch of those when we were kids, and that's something we can achieve in a relatively, sort of a short time frame. And you're not aligning with success, because a puzzle platformer, sadly, these days has a very poor chance of making any money. It's one of the genres that's really struggling. It's oversaturated and underperforms. And so you're kind of you solved for what you wanted to make, what you thought was fun. You solve for what you can do in a relatively short time frame, or the resources you have, but you didn't solve for what could succeed. And so then ultimately you fail, because you make a puzzle platformer, even if it's fun, you make no money. Now that also requires that we've discussed what kind of success we're trying to achieve, right? If I say, well, I want to be a millionaire and make tons of money making awesome games, and you say, well, I don't care about money, I just want to make art and win awards, we're going to go in very different directions. It's hard to kind of build a studio together if ultimately we're sort of competing. I'm trying to make something that's going to make money. You're trying to go win awards and whatever. So we as founders, as co-founders, need to have a real conversation of like, okay, hey man, like, what does success mean to you, and what does success mean to me? Are we both trying to go after the same success? So that's this kind of success alignment, solving for success, is kind of one like huge pattern I see, essentially from all studios all over the world. And then the other one would be not understanding that you are ultimately in the fan building business. If you ask a game developer, a game founder, whatever, and say, hey, what business are you in? Like 99% of the time, they're going to say, well, I'm a game developer. I'm in the business of making games. Like that, I'm a studio. I'm an indie. My business is making games. And if that's the mindset, like, you're going to fail. And if your business is just making games, then go do work for hire, go get a job at Ubisoft, don't even be an indie. It's not worth it. So you have to reframe it as being in the fan building business, growing an audience, building a community, capturing a fan base, which then also implies that you've identified who your fans should be or could be, which then requires you to sort of like I often give the example, like I'm a space nerd, I like all things sci-fi, whatever. If I were to build a studio, I'd say it's going to be a studio to go after sci-fi nerds and geeks that love Star Wars, Star Trek, all that kind of stuff. And so I'm not really like sitting there building a game. I'm building a studio that's going to go capture all of the sci-fi nerds out there in the world, and I'm going to make cool sci-fi games to kind of make them fall in love with me. And like, that's how I build a long-term sustainable business, is really about building a fan business, as opposed to I'm just trying to make one game at a time. So that also is kind of an important pattern that's very difficult for most game developers to kind of grasp. But when you tell them, they're like, oh crap, oh yeah, oh, that makes a lot of sense. And their mind starts to kind of shift.
That reframing that Jason provided really changes everything if you think about it. Well, first and foremost, let's go back to what he first led in with about redefining success. I mean, if you think about it, it's so important. And I know earlier I was kind of expanding a little bit more on that concept, but especially when you have other partners involved, other team members, but also even, reflecting upon yourself and really understanding what success means. It can really dictate a lot, but we don't realize how impactful or how much it can actually dictate. So that really put things into perspective. But what I also love too, and what I was alluding to earlier, when Jason called out about like, hey, you're in the fan building business. And when he called out to that, there was a lot of things I was reading between the lines there. Well, one, and this is one of the biggest problems I've always had with indies in general. No offense. But a lot of time when people were either approaching me or in general, I'd hear people there, it's like, well, what are you what are you making or whatever? And they would say, oh, I'm making just this one game. And then I'm like, what else? And then they're like, well, what do you mean what else? It's just this game that I'm making. And honestly, there's nothing wrong with this. But if you take that lens that, Jason was sharing in the fan building business, he is looking at it from a perspective of like, okay, well, by him sharing the insight if he were to make a studio and he loves sci-fi stuff and he's going to focus on the sci-fi stuff and everything, immediately that whole perspective implies there's just more than one game. There's just more than that's it, maybe even that single studio or whatever it is, whatever your space is, your bubble is like or whatever. There's always more. But we often don't see it as that way. And I think it's just because we get tied into what we know, what we're familiar with, and everything else. But these concepts and everything else really go much further, go much deeper. And remember how I was saying earlier about commenting, and I know Jason did in a different context about how some of when they're defining success, and it's, let's say, a lot of people are focused on the passion behind the project and everything else. But what I found really interesting is the fact that he used that example where he's like, I want to make a studio that's focusing on sci-fi experiences because I love sci-fi experiences. What he was calling out to was really defining a form of alignment. And this type of alignment, I think, is very powerful, meaningful, and purposeful for the studios that do this, for the developers that do this. Because if you think about it, he's focused, through that example, he's saying, hey, look, I care about this thing. I love it. And therefore, I'm going to make a studio about it and build this for other fans that love this thing too. Those are all things that align. And when we think of things this way, it gives us a lot more intent and purpose. And therefore, in the end, you're still building with passion. You're still creating games with passion. But with this new lens and approach, you're doing it for your own passion and to align it with others. Again, building for fans. But I know when we hear this like terminology, like you're in the fan building business, it almost sounds like, oh, we're doing this for other people, not ourselves. But what Jason shared just then isn't what that is. It's saying, I am building for myself and others, and that's going to create the best scenario possible. Because you love what you're doing, you can get feedback from others about what you love doing, and that's going to just fuel that everything else. So it and gives you fulfillment, and that leads into the other aspects too of how do you define success. Because what's the point of doing this if it's just for money, for fame, for awards, for whatever it might be, those results, those outcomes? Because at the end of the day, it's also about what is meaningful and important to you. What gets you to wake up the next day? Because I can tell you this, yes, money helps, but it's not going to be money in the end. So, and I think this is important because, especially when we come across in certain times, these types of things can be grounding. It gives us something to look forward to keep us stable, and to build towards something that's meaningful and purposeful, even when things start feeling shaky or uncertain. But once we get to a point where we can adopt that particular mindset, you're still going to need clarity. Because you can't build for everyone, right? You can't make everyone happy. And because of that, we then need to kind of double down sometimes on how we can focus on things. So in episode 401, we had Juliana Brito on the show. And the conversation that I had with her was great because this is where I felt focus was a common theme that came up in terms of how we can survive, right? How people can survive. And honestly, it's not just this year. I would say in general, because this isn't a creative ideal or concept, right? This is a bit more objective, I would say. And there's one thing that I absolutely loved in this particular conversation I had with Juliana, which was what she described as the Ikigai framework. If you're not familiar with that book, there's a book about it, or the concept. It's a Japanese term. I would say definitely get yourself familiar with it. But what she talks about here, this framework, it ultimately just gives teams a way to step back and really ask the hard questions before they start committing to years of effort to something that might not be aligned. And man, those conversations can be hard, but you know what they do? They de-risk all that time, energy, and effort put into something that might not even work out in the end. So here's that conversation with Juliana, and yeah, it's definitely one of my favorites.
What would you say are some, I don't know, common business or marketing blind spots, that you see, some of these indie teams that are coming out of jams? Like they get in there, they're excited, and let's say they want to take another step and have that intent to, start building that legacy. But what are some, issues that happen as they're moving forward?
I think the main issue that I normally see is that everybody wants to think about the game they want to do, but not with about the people that are going to play the game when it's ready.
Mm.
So they're always thinking, oh, I want to do this game and so on. I don't know if you heard about it. Like some people talk about the ikigai of games. Ikigai is a Japanese concept of like getting some stuff from your life and found the center of it. So the ikigai of game would be like a game that I can do, that my team is able to perform, a game that I in the genre that we like. So everybody in the team actually likes that type of game. So that's also common play. But also a game that people want to play. There is a market viability to it and so on. So like when you put these three things together, I can execute, it's something we like and people want to play. Then we have the resources, the right resources to do it. You have kind of ikigai of game. So I think that's something people just normally feel like the games that I like. They don't think if they can actually execute this or who is the market need these games. So that's one point. And the second one, because they don't think about that, they don't think about sales, they don't think about the marketing. And every time I ask, so what's your marketing strategy to sell this game? And people say, like, I will find a publisher.
Yes.
That's the marketing strategy. So find a publisher. And I was like, okay. So Jason Hawker did some statistics about it. And he talked like, he did some research with a lot of publishers. And he got to the number that for 1,000 pitches that publisher sees, they end up closing 1.16 deal.
Yes. Yep.
That's 0.16% of people that actually get to the point of pitching the game actually gonna close a deal. Mm-hmm. Doesn't seem like a smart marketing strategy to work with these kind of numbers. So if you do a game already thinking about self-publishing, already thinking about the buyer of this game, you can use the doing of the game to build your own community, to bring people already in since like the first day. Just document your game jam, like we're starting this new project, put everything on social media, start growing your like base, your Discord server, and so on and so on. And I think that's the main thing people miss on game jams, like the business and marketing side of it, and just, I'll find a publisher.
So what I really liked about what Juliana said, and what makes that conversation so powerful, is that framework she shared, the Ikigai framework. It really helps reduce a lot of anxiety. And let's think about it. Now, there can be some initial anxiety in that process, right? When we're asking ourselves these questions like, what do people want to play? Do we have the resources to make it? And what does the market want? And these are some challenging questions that honestly we got to answer at some point in time. And actually, I'm going to take a step back. What I find so interesting about this clip too is that if you listen to the clip, you could probably pick up on the context that the episode in particular was about game jams. And she's sharing this framework with teams participating in these game jams. And these game jams, what typically happen within a very, very small, short development cycle. But still, she is posing that framework because she understands and knows the value that it has in reducing that anxiety or reducing the potential for a project going in the wrong direction, spending too much time on something. So when we take it out of that context into the situation most of us are in, which is we're not participating in a game jam, and we're using what she call her framework she describes, the Ikigai framework, I think that's really impactful. Because what it does is it can eliminate so much time, effort, energy, resources being used up or even potentially wasted. Because you might be working on something that doesn't align with the market. You might be working something that doesn't align with your team's skills or even your values. And that last one too, which I know I found kind of funny and stuff, but if you think about it, like really understanding the reality of the situation when, and even if it's an area you're not comfortable, like marketing could be, not just relying on someone else, like saying, oh, I'll just have a publisher handle that. Because if the odds are that small, what, 1.6%, she said, and those are of the people who actually pitch to a publisher, then why would we ever default to something like that, especially if we so much want to have our games made? Right? If you look at it that way, it's like, wow, where's the disconnect and stuff? And it's funny how we get caught in these things. But you could probably at one point see where you might have went astray a little bit. And it really comes down to understanding and context. It's not meaning you're doing anything wrong. It's just part of the journey. It's part of the process of learning. So that's what I really loved about what Juliana shared. Because in a year where so many resources were probably tighter than ever, it still comes back to what I shared earlier. Clarity still wasn't optional. And in fact, if anything, having that level of clarity, or at least what Juliana described in that framework, you can kind of see it as a form of protection. And you know, once you have a level of clarity that things start to click, things start to becoming much clearer in terms of the direction you're headed, where you need to go, and those things. Another way to kind of then start thinking things at that point is, well, great, I have this clarity, but now what do I do to actually create an experience that is meaningful to players, that actually sticks with them? And that's really important too, because when we get to that point, that's almost like, in a way, a defining moment, because when we get to that level, or when we're getting to that point where we need to understand what that is, that could be the make or break point. That gets into the area of how to make a great game. Or as I like to say, how to make a game for the right audience. Well, in episode 409, Nicholas O'Brien, he talks about the emotional design, like emotional, meaningful design and things like that. And this one really stood out to me because what it does is it kind of moves beyond a bit of systems and strategy that's associated with game design. And I'm not saying those things are irrelevant or not important. But what his conversation, provided me context for, or what I took it as, is it was something a bit more human. And if you've heard me on the show before, you know that one of the key things that I think could really lead to people getting more momentum as everything else is practicing is through practicing more empathy. So in this clip, Nicholas talks about ambiguity and ultimately trusting players enough to kind of let them fill in the gaps with the experiences that they're having. And, in the past year, when people were really trying to better understand the meaning behind things and not just like content and everything, really trying to get down to the why. I thought this particular conversation was extremely relevant because it went in a little bit deeper than some of the other conversations we typically have when it comes to game design. So here's that conversation with Nicholas.
As we stated earlier, we know you're an educator and everything, and as one, and this is really applicable to anybody, but like, how do you encourage, let's say, either students or people starting out, or honestly anybody, like someone working on their next project that maybe want to explore things and do things a little differently, to bring concepts like vulnerability or even personal themes into their work? Because, and hopefully it's not too much of a loaded question, because I know that could be really challenging for people, like what's too much, or asking who really cares and things like that. But
100%. Yeah.
If we're bringing these aspects that are true and authentic, and that's our intent, that's our purpose and our message that we want to get out there, what are some good ways that maybe that can be done in some way, shape, or form?
Yeah, it's a big question. It's a really big question. And I totally appreciate you asking. And I think that what I would say is look to other games that are finding really amazing supportive audiences that are doing that work already, right? I would say, like, for me, a big touchstone for some of the maybe not design motivations, but certainly thinking about the potential audience overlap was a game called Venba. And Venba, for anybody that doesn't know, is a really beautiful short narrative game that's about identity and an immigrant experience and shifting between kind of a cultural perspective of your ancestors and a new cultural perspective that you're trying to grapple with and trying to find a sense of belonging and home within that tension, right? Again, we're talking about tension. But for me, what I found like so compelling about that project was, how vulnerable it was, how willing it was to be not saccharine, right? Like not just overwhelming with emotion and, trying to be tear jerky or anything like that, but instead being very honest about not knowing how potentially the narrative stuff would land, right? It was kind of a little bit of a gamble, I think, for the developers and designers. And they had some really good feedback rounds and had some really good community support to keep going, which is amazing. But I think also something that they did that I would really encourage a lot of designers to do that are doing message-driven games is to be okay with ambiguity. I oftentimes think that narrative designers and game designers sometimes really want to wrap things up in a very nice bow, right? Like really want to have something that's like, oh, this feels super succinct and super clear and, or has a very rewarding dénouement, right? Like the action climax happens and it has this very conclusion, very nice conclusion, right? I think that's great. And I love games that do that. But I think sometimes allowing a player to be in an ambiguous space, being in an uncertain space, and then filling in the blanks on their own can be the way where you let them cross the finish line, right? Instead of being like, okay, now at the end of this, you feel sad or what, or you feel hopeful, or you feel vulnerable, or whatever it might be, right? You leave room within the narrative for the player to fill in those emotional gaps, right? And to be okay as a designer with them potentially filling in the gaps with something that you didn't expect or you didn't intend, right? I think that kind of letting loose a little bit, or loosening one's grips on the reins a bit, can be actually a really emotionally charged and powerful reward as a designer. Yeah, because then you get to see like how the thing that you made lands with potentially a very wide array of audiences.
You know, the thing that I really loved about Nicholas's take here. Well, one, I'll just call it out. When I was listening to this clip again, I remember how my instincts were going against what he was saying initially when he was talking about that structure and stuff. It reminded me of of my days in filmmaking school and how to write a script and 3-act structure and all that stuff. And and he says like it doesn't always need to be clear, and for me I was like pushing back internally and thinking no, it's important to be clear. But then when he talked about this concept of ambiguity and the idea of how we can make these experiences, more meaningful for players, right? And in that process too, it really says that a lot about how much confidence is in this idea, is in this concept, right? And think about it. There's confidence in the player in a way, in how they experience it and everything. And not only that, let's like if you dive deeper, what does this really mean for the experience of the player? What does it mean in terms of how it resonates with them? It's almost like it's multifaceted, because without it being so distinct and directly focused and pinpointing to a specific way that you're trying to convey or show that players should feel, you're kind of opening up to a bit so everybody's going to experience this a bit differently. And I would say that people do in general anyways, even in a very clear structure, but this is, I don't know. I guess a good analogy, just mind blown type moment here, right? But also it says another thing too. When he was talking about that team and stuff, it really showcases in the confidence they had in the work that they were doing. Because honestly, from what I know in my years in doing this concept and idea is really getting into some uncharted territory. And it gets me thinking too, where we're always trying to find an answer for something, right? We're always trying, and because through these answers that we get, it gives us more control. And we're all about trying to gain and get more control. But at least in this context, around, this emotional design, well, some of the most memorable experiences, they're not going to explain everything. And they really shouldn't. Because what they're doing, and what Nicholas is calling out, they invite players to participate emotionally and in their own way and experience these games in their own way, not just, mechanically or very specifically designed. And I think that's something very powerful, and why we don't probably talk about it too much or see it happening too much either. And as, I shared too in that clip, I believe it was, it is very challenging for people to do this. But I think it really helps us understand and look where sometimes when we look at things different like this and we lead with the confidence for something like this that we believe in, but we're not, and it's not just about us creating this experience, right? We're creating it for players too. And so you can see how this direction kind of like shares this concept on both sides. It's universal in a way, from a creator perspective and also from a player perspective. And that's the other reason why I like this so much, is because it's not a one-way street here in this idea and concept. And when we do that, it really does create something unique. And on the show before, I've talked about memorable moments and things like that. Well, this is just, who knows? And I know it's definitely getting into the abstract a little bit and everything. But I think there's something here. I think there's something really cool that if we think about and explore a little bit more, there could be a whole new wave of games on the horizon. Again, that's just me looking at the glass as half full. Because if you think about it, if we create spaces and experiences such as what Nicholas is calling out to, and where there's this level of uncertainty, it creates this anticipation that's exciting. And when we're able to establish that kind of trust and emotional space, it can be incredibly powerful. And, you know, and this idea and concept all leads to one final idea, especially in a year like this. And what I'm leading into here is this clip, this conversation I had with Chris Wood in episode 393. And the reason why I wanted to end here is because this discussion we had reframes what I feel something many people felt insecure about this year in general. Because what I think we all realize at this point now, and we should by now, is that this past year, and even, this past year, reminded us that size doesn't equal safety. No one is too big to fail. No one is too big to not lay off, right? But that aside, we also realize that big studios struggled too. And let's throw out the reasons why, what we know or what we believe, why they struggle. Because I think that sometimes can get into some gray areas or some areas that we don't really understand or know the truth behind. And we make assumptions because we're emotionally charged. We're being reactive. And I know, trust me, I know it might be hard to look at things that way. But let's just look at it as simply as this. Big studios struggle too. And what I like what Chris has shared in this conversation and what he does a great job at doing is reminding us what small teams actually have going for them. And that means you guys. So hear this one from Chris.
But it's like, what would you say are some of the, these advantages? I know I was essentially mentioning this too, but what are some of these like advantages that these small studios have compared to larger companies? And what else like makes them more resilient? What else can have them really stand out? I mean, you shared the example with Hooded Horse and Manor Lords, that developer, but anything else that comes to mind? Like, because I know I feel this way, but I want to get your take on it.
So I can only speak from experience, and I've only ever run a small studio because this is the first time I've started my own thing, and we built up from nothing to 35 people, so we're still relatively small. kind of almost having faith in that model of smaller companies are just better. And there's a million reasons why. Partly we can move so much more quickly. We can pivot. We can change the way we approach things. Tanglewood, we probably went down the typical route early on of finding the biggest deals with the biggest clients to give them as many people as possible, because that's kind of how you grow a service studio. That was the orthodox thinking. As long as you're not just working with one client, because then you're not really independent. Like 3 or 4, that would be great. So that's the approach that we went for quite a long time. But you realize quite quickly that your exposure to those projects and those teams and those new clients is pretty huge. And that when the industry is challenging and projects have their budgets reduced and projects get cancelled, that's pretty scary. So we deliberately, as a small company, we're not answerable to anybody. We can do things quickly. We just pivoted it. It was the start of 2024, and we went for, okay, let's have way more clients. Let's provide small teams. What our clients want anyway, they want to be able to move quickly. They want to get an engineering team from us quickly. They don't particularly want to pay a massive amount of money for it. They don't need a load of people. They might only need 2, 3, 4 people from us. And actually at that level, on relatively large projects, that's kind of fitting into the slack on in the budget. It's not like it needs to go right up to corporate headquarters for someone to approve another chunk of money from somewhere. It's maybe just the contingency that they've got anyway. So they want to be able to bring people on quickly. They don't necessarily want to commit to 6 months or 12 months or even more. They just want to pick you up for a month, maybe 3 months. We try to go for 3 months because it's hard to really make a contribution in 1 month in a meaningful way. So 3 months is very, very common, where someone will take a few people from us for 3 months. But we deliberately pivoted to that last year. So we don't put massive teams on any of our clients' projects. We don't book in huge blocks of work. It's a lot more dynamic. There's a lot more business development work to do. There are a lot more negotiations, but you can do it all quickly. And that's kind of what people want. And it's worked consistently well for us. And I don't think we could really do that. Like, when I talk to bigger code dev studios, they always say, yeah, you're in such a good position, the way that you can work, the way you can work with clients, lots of different clients. You can sell people just engineers because that's what you do. It's harder for the big companies to do that or make those kind of decisions. So we're always at an advantage being small in terms of the culture, the decision making, how quickly we can do things. Like I strongly believe that it's the right model, and that the games industry of the future will consist way more, to a much greater extent, of smaller, more creative, more individual, more specialized companies. And when I'm talking about standardization and working together and stuff like that, it's just my mind kind of, the cogs in my brain going, trying to figure out how we do that at a greater scale, or we do it more efficiently, or we collaborate with each other more fluidly almost. Because those are the things that are the downsides of being small. You're this kind of, it can feel like you're on your own sometimes if you're not collaborating with lots of other companies.
You know, this is such an empowering reminder. I mean, there was so much that Chris shared here. It's everything from how small teams can pivot, change, be adaptable. They can move faster. They can talk directly to other people. And I know the context he's providing this from is, basically being a work for hire studio. But honestly, the concept and principles, the logic behind what he's talking about doesn't change anything for anybody else. So let's say you listening don't plan or don't want to do anything work for hire. But everything Chris said is still very much applicable to you, and probably things that you may have heard from others too. Like, actually, it's not necessarily much different than a little bit what Juliana was sharing earlier in her framework, where if you're doing things in smaller bite sizes, smaller, if you're having a smaller development cycle, right? Because ultimately, when Chris shared that they went from working at 3 clients to many clients, smaller teams working on these things, that exposure to other clients and those projects was invaluable. It teaches them how to be even more adaptable. It teaches them how to be more resilient, how to solve lots of problems fairly quickly. And the more they worked with different projects, the more they could figure these things out. And so again, look how you can take what he learned. Yes, it was from a work from hire perspective, and apply it to your own situation, which is making smaller games, making them faster and everything else, getting them to market, understanding these things. And then when you do that, what does it ultimately do? Well, he didn't call out to this, but I saw this right away. By doing that, by having all that exposure, by able to move quickly and fast, making faster decisions, they're taking action. I think I've said it before on the show, like, I would rather take an okay or make an okay decision now than a perfect one some significant amount of time in the future, some other time, because there's a huge opportunity cost there. There's a huge amount of loss that you can, that will become a burden by not making fast decisions. And the key thing there, what Chris was saying was, without saying it, was by making those changes with his studio, they were reducing their risk. Smaller projects, they got to learn more, they got to solve problems faster. And if they solve problems faster, if they know how to do things faster, then that means they can take on more client work. So how does that apply to your case? Most likely, you work on more projects that, even if they're your own IP or whatever, you get those out faster. You learn, okay, the market didn't like this one. Why? Understand that. Move on to the next one. And then you keep hashing those things out. Yes, I know it doesn't sound really economical, or maybe it's not exactly what we're looking for. And that's okay too. But ultimately what he's sharing is he was reducing risk. He was reducing a lot of friction. And because of that, they were able to grow exponentially. They were able to achieve a lot more than I think they probably initially thought. And I could be completely wrong in saying that, but I think what I really want to say, or a better way to say, is they were probably surprised that just with that one shift, they started to really understand the power that they had in their size. And yes, I know 35 to some of us can sound like a pretty big number, and it is. But from the experience and in his perspective, that's small, but still, there was something so powerful about that. And they recognized that just from those simple shifts that they made. And that's why I think it's so important that you recognize that in yourself too. And how that can actually be applied to the work that you do. Because you are more resilient. You can pivot very quickly. You can make decisions relatively fast. And, in looking back at the past year, where so much felt like it was out of our control, I think what Chris is saying really does a great job of highlighting where agency still exists, where we do have control, and not just what that control is, but what it actually means for us and what it means and how we can use it to move forward. So if you look at all these conversations from today together, you know, they start to form a pretty clear arc. You know, this past year forced a lot of us to confront reality, and definitely the harsher side of it. You know, it challenged how we define success, what that actually means for us. Is it even important? And if it isn't, then we need to reevaluate that again. It also pushed us to get clearer about our focus, about our intentions. And it reminded us that emotional resonance does matter. It's not just about making something perfect or structurally sound. There's so much more to what we're doing and what we're creating than I think we lead ourselves to believe. And if anything, it really showed us that being small isn't a weakness. If anything, it's a huge, huge leverage. It's big. You know, 2025 stripped away a lot of illusions about stability in the industry. No doubt about that. But honestly, the way I've always seen these things, the year 2025 is irrelevant. There's going to be some year, some point in time where we start seeing these things happen in the past again. These things repeat themselves. They always will. They'll just be what I call is, different game, same playing field. But what this past year did in particular, I think what it also, like I said, past years probably do too. It clarified something important. Resilience. It doesn't come from scale or certainty. It really comes down to that thing I was talking about in the very beginning. It comes from clarity, adaptability, and connection. You know, empathy. So as we head into a new year, and honestly, yes, I know timing of the show when it's aired, it's appropriate. But honestly, as you head into whatever part of your journey that you're on next, let's just say this. You don't need everything figured out. In fact, you probably are never going to have everything figured out. It's just the truth. But what you need to understand isn't how everything can be perfect and getting the right pieces together. It's about understanding what you're building, who you're building it for, and what kind of experiences you actually want to create. And the last one is, you know, the most important too is why? Why are you doing this? And when you start asking yourselves all those questions, and there's some tough ones, and you're not going to get the answers for them right away. I know I didn't when I went on my journey, you know, through what I'm doing now. But the more that you self-evaluate, the more that you ask these things, the more that you look at these different perspectives and try to like put that whole picture together. Again, it's just going to get you a step closer to having that clarity. And that clarity is going to lead you to confidence. And that confidence is just going to keep going, having you go in the direction that you ultimately want to go in anyways. And it's not blinding. Because I think in this episode and in these themes that are presented and what I've been seeing over throughout the year, if you look at things this way, I would find it very, very hard to believe that you wouldn't be on the right course to put you ahead where you're looking to go. And it might not be where you originally thought. And that's okay too. And that's where it goes back to you don't need everything figured out. So if you take anything from this episode today, Just let it be this. Your constraints, whatever they are, whatever you believe they are, whatever you actually know that they are, they're not holding you back. Nope. If anything, they are shaping the way forward. And you have way more control, way more agency than you might think. So as you move forward, don't ever forget that. You are in control, and you have way more control than anything else that's going on around you. Thank you so much for being here, for listening to the show. I appreciate you and wish you the best of the next year and many years to follow.
Hey everyone, thank you for listening to another episode of Indie Game Movement. I'm Andrew Pappas, your host, and the show's producer is Mustafa Price. Show notes for this episode can be found by visiting rengenmarketing.com, the number episode of the show. Rengen Marketing is a consulting marketing company that helps indie devs with their marketing efforts. Whether you need guidance with your game's marketing strategy or could use a free marketing plan template, then please visit www.rengenmarketing.com and take action. A special thanks to Dakota Saw for Season 2's opening theme and Melissa Gellis for the new logo design. And as always, thanks for being such great listeners, and we'll see you next time on Indie Game Movement.